calling it meat. He was being very complimentary in doing that. But I also am reminded that anybody who has had dogs or who's had piranha, one of the dangers in throwing out meat is that you get your hand bitten as well. But again, it is my privilege to have an opportunity and to gather with you and to have, and Ron was right, ruminations of my heart and life and reflection upon the message of holiness and this doctrine of entire sanctification. And it really comes out of not only my own personal experience of entire sanctification in my life, but a sincere desire to lead people into that experience as well. And so I'm sharing ideas and thoughts with you, and by no means am what I'm sharing with you is somehow conclusive. And so to have an opportunity to be in dialogue and to have an opportunity to be in conversation with you is most helpful. And so I appreciate your insights, appreciate your questions, and appreciate helping me to see things from a different perspective and in a different light. And I give thanks for this opportunity. And so I'm hoping again that today, in many ways, while I'm going to be sharing some stuff with you, sharing some information with you, that really what takes place in our time together is more dialogical in nature. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity to share and ask questions, but feel free, either in our time of questions, in our time of dialogue, or inside this kind of class period and outside of the class period as well, to stop and ask questions, make points, disagree with me. I'm open and fine with that. Let me begin our time together by just mentioning a couple of things. First of all, I think that it is really important, and especially because of the way that I'm coming about talking about this issue of entire sanctification. And I tend to be focused in this on the issue of sin and how God deals with and addresses the issue of sin in our life. That you might mistakenly get the idea that entire sanctification is something that is preoccupied with the issue of sin. And I think that we would be in error if that is the case. There is a sense in which the end of entire sanctification is not just to deal with the issue of sin in our life. The end of entire sanctification is to set us free to love and to serve. To set us free to love God with all heart, soul, mind, and strength. And to love our neighbor. And even our neighbor defined as enemy, as we love ourselves. I love the Westminster Catechism. I have to admit, because it is in the Reformed tradition, that there are elements and aspects of the Westminster Catechism with which I would disagree. But in many ways, it states some of the beautiful truths of Christianity in it. And of course, many of us know the very first question that is in the Westminster Catechism, and it is the question, what is the chief end of man? What is the chief purpose of humanity? And the answer to that question is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Now, I don't want to say that the Westminster Catechism and the answer to that question is wrong. I think our end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. But I certainly like our more Wesleyan spin on that issue and taking seriously what Jesus said were the greatest commandments. And I really believe that our chief end in life is to love God with all heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love neighbor as self. And this work of entire sanctification is a work of divine grace in our hearts and in our lives that enable us unto that end. And so God liberates us from the power and hold of sin. Not just to liberate us from the power and hold of sin, but to set us free, to liberate us to love, and to bring us into the divine relationship of love. So that's the first thing. I just wanted to be clear, because You could look at what I'm doing and say this is a preoccupation with the whole issue of sin. But there is a sense in which this is what has to be addressed in our life if God is going to move us to ultimately where He wants us to be in life. One of the things I have observed, at least in my life, anybody who has been genuinely converted eventually comes to a place in his or her life in which they meet and come up against a brick wall. There is the desire and there is the hunger to serve God. There is the desire and there is the hunger to love God and be obedient to God. And yet, you come to a place in your life where it seems that end is impossible to us. You come to face that with this internal conflict that exists within the human heart and in the human life. You meet the obstacles of life, and in meeting the obstacles of life, you realize there's not the power within you, not the wherewithal within you, to be able to be faithful to Jesus in the midst of those obstacles in life. And so one comes to this place where one recognizes the severe limitations that are placed upon us. And the question inevitably arises, what do we do then? Is there a work of God's grace that can be done in the human heart, in human life, that can move us beyond the brick wall, the obstacle that is there, that can liberate us to love and to serve, to be like Christ? And I thank God for our Wesleyan Arminian holiness tradition that has emphasized this teaching of entire sanctification and holds out the promise that indeed there is a work that God can do in our hearts and in our lives. But please know the chief end is to liberate us to love and to liberate us to serve. The second thing that I want to share with you, and again, this is one of the things that kind of drives my ministry and drives my thinking, and that is to help a new generation not only enter into this experience of entire sanctification, but enable a new generation to be able to articulate it, to be able to share it, to preach it, to teach it, and equip people to be able to lead other people into the experience of it. Now, it is a heartwarming experience for me to have this opportunity to come here to Wesley Biblical Seminary, where I see the message of entire sanctification so prevalent. And I see students who are able to talk about it and hear testimonies. I was just, since I've been here, I've had the privilege of hearing students come up and talk to me about their testimony of entering in. It warms my heart to hear this. Because we face a problem in the larger Wesleyan Arminian holiness tradition. We have a generation that is my generation, and I have to let you know, I look older than I am, but I just turned 40 years old. But there is a dearth of people in my generation and younger who can articulate, who can preach, who can teach this doctrine of entire sanctification and lead people into the experience of it. Now, we have an older generation that could articulate it, that could communicate it, and could help people enter into the experience of it. But I'm looking for the next generation. I'm looking for the next generation. And so my passion is to help people be able to see the truth of this teaching and to be able to communicate the truth of that teaching, and who can help people enter into the experience of it. This is Tuesday, I believe. I'm kind of losing track of time. Is it Wednesday? I have lost track of time. That's right, it is, isn't it? I'm sorry, haven't turned on a TV and haven't seen a newspaper since I've been here. So, oh, that's not true. I watched the Philadelphia. I want you to know, Ron Smith. I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, and Ron Smith forced me to watch his Philadelphia Eagles on Monday night. I should have realized that was Monday Night Football. But I was going to say on Tuesday, and boy, I really missed it. I was praying today, but I really missed it. I have the privilege at Indiana Wesleyan University, Tuesday at noon during the lunch hour, I meet with a group of students at Indiana Wesleyan University who are earnestly seeking the experience of entire sanctification in their life. And so what we do on Tuesday is we fast the noon hour, and we come together and we pray and we talk and we seek the experience of entire sanctification. And this has been going on for 3 years now on our campus. And I thank God that there are some of our students who have entered into the experience. And so my prayer for you here at Wesley Biblical Seminary is that in your time here, if you haven't already entered into this experience, that you will. But I pray for you as well that this generation, my generation, the generation under me, that God would raise up a group of people who could once again, with power and authority, articulate this doctrine. You heard me on Monday night, for those of you who did, and I do believe that for the most part, if it's not something that is communicated, if it's not something that we preach, if it's not something that we teach, if it's not something that we communicate in our lives, most likely it's not going to be experienced in the lives of the people who are entrusted to our care. And so it's important for us to be able to do that. And so, again, these sort of ideas I just want to put before you at the very beginning of this session. One, that while I tend to be focused on this whole issue of sin in our life, please, that the ultimate end of entire sanctification is to set us free to love and to serve. And that a second driving passion behind this, and maybe the reason why I'm giving you this spectrum and trying to parse out different understandings, is to help clarify your understanding and a Wesleyan understanding of these issues, so that it might be more clearly articulated and that we can speak with greater confidence to it in the ministries that God is calling us to, and particularly to the people who are and will be entrusted to our care. Now, what I want to do today is I want to take this opportunity to look at, again, this whole concept that is kind of the driving theme of this lecture series. Too high, too low, too hard, too easy. Navigating the Wesleyan teaching on entire sanctification. And in our last session, we talked about different understandings that exist in the church and how we go about appropriating the work of salvation in life. And one of the things that I argued, how we generally understand how salvation is appropriated in life, is generally how we understand how entire sanctification is appropriated in life. We also then spent another session beginning to look at kind of a spectrum of understanding of holiness, of sanctification, and particularly entire sanctification that exists within the church. And so trying to paint a larger spectrum to begin to talk now more specifically about these issues. And specifically what I want to do in our session this morning is I want to talk about the actual different ways that entire sanctification, specifically the content, what does it entail, is articulated in the Wesleyan holiness tradition. And there is a sense in which the spectrum that I have given to you, again, is this idea of kind of the highest understanding and the lowest understanding as to what entire sanctification is. These different definitions that I have given to you can at times and places be found in writings, and at times and places can be found in theologians, and then at other times and places is what we hear articulated in our Wesleyan Arminian holiness churches, and in our Wesleyan Arminian Holiness camp meetings. So again, I just want to kind of help us to see that there are really different understandings of sanctification, entire sanctification, that exists within our tradition. And so you have a handout that's been given to you on one side of it. And what I've tried to do on this one side is to move from the lowest understanding of entire sanctification to the highest understanding of entire sanctification. So you will notice I talk about entire consecration as entire sanctification. There is a sense in which I am saying that that is the lowest understanding of entire sanctification that exists within Wesleyan Arminian circles. And then freedom from all temptation, an understanding of entire sanctification that sets us free not only from all sin but all temptation, is a view that is the highest understanding of entire sanctification. Now, I'm going to just simply talk about these different views, and then later I'm going to talk about what are legitimate understandings and what are illegitimate understandings of entire sanctification. So, let's take a look. You will notice on the back of the sheet I've given you sort of a detailed summary of different type of teachings that are related to these particular views. So let us look first of all at the lowest view. And this lowest view is what I call entire sanctification as entire consecration. And in this particular view, the premium in understanding entire sanctification is placed upon the act of entire consecration. And so there's a sense in which one so focuses upon entire consecration that there's a sense in which one might overlook willful sin, one might overlook the sin nature, and there is a sense in which one might not emphasize as much being set free to love. But the focus is on entire consecration. And from this perspective, entirely sanctified Christians earnestly desire to follow Christ, to love God and to love neighbor. And so there's the desire there. There is the intention. One places oneself on the altar of God, surrenders absolutely everything that one has to God, and one has the intention to love God and to love neighbor, and to serve God and to serve neighbor. But there still may be strongholds of sin, patterns of sin, that may still be in that person's life. They still may succumb to ungodly manifestations of pride and selfishness, and may still give in to temptations in moments, although in the moment that was not necessarily their intention in doing it. Now, this sort of thinking has its foundation in the 19th century teaching of Phoebe Palmer, and specifically the idea of altar theology. That what we do is we come and we place ourselves entirely on the altar. We consecrate ourselves entirely to God. And then there is the assumption that when we do that, we place everything on the altar. In the moment that we do that, God comes and sanctifies us entirely. And so there are times and places in the Wesleyan Church, I do some consulting work and I meet with boards of ordained ministries. And I meet people who serve on boards of ordained ministry in the Wesleyan Church who have a basic understanding of entire sanctification as entire consecration. And so when they discuss the issue of entire sanctification, they will ask prospective ministerial students, have you consecrated all to God? And if a student says that they have consecrated all to God, then there are boards that will simply say, well, you were entirely sanctified then at that point. And there's a sense in which, in this perspective, a lot of things can be lumped into the whole issue of sins of infirmity, which we talked a little bit about yesterday, or that can be lumped into issues that are involved in surprising moments. That, I didn't intend to do that, but in the moment I ended up doing it. And again, that tends to be lumped into the issue of sins of infirmity. But there is this understanding that exists: to simply give my life entirely to Christ is to be entirely sanctified. And it can also be articulated in this whole idea of having an earnest desire. I have a purity of intention, or that overall in my life I have this desire to love God and to serve God. And so focus is placed on the fact that we've laid ourselves on the altar. The focus is placed upon the earnest desire to serve God and to love God, the earnest desire to serve neighbor and to love neighbor. And that in and of itself is entire sanctification. So I call this position entire sanctification as entire consecration. And consider this to be the lowest view of entire sanctification. Next is entire sanctification as freedom from willful sin. The focus is on freedom from willful sin, not necessarily freedom from an orientation to sin or rebellion, and not necessarily being set free to love. From this perspective, entirely sanctified Christians can be free from willful sin, living lives of obedience to God, but cannot be completely delivered from original sin in the present life. Christians will persistently struggle with an inner attitude of rebellion, selfishness, and pride, but they can live above it. And again, the premium in this understanding of entire sanctification is freedom from willful sin. Now, this view does have its foundations in what I call the cross-pollination that took place in the Holiness movement and the Keswick movement in the 19th century, in the latter half of the 19th century, and the influences of people like D.L. Moody and Hannah Whitehall Smith. And there is a sense in which this is an idea that still pervades our Wesleyan holiness tradition. So, if I'm able to testify to the fact that I am able to live in obedience to God, in the commands of God, and that through an examination of my heart and life I can testify that I am free from willful sin, then I can be said to be entirely sanctified in that perspective. And so the second view, which is a lower view but not the lowest view, the focus on entire sanctification is the focus upon being free from willful sin in this life. Then there is the third position, which I have called C, and it is entire sanctification as freedom from willful and original sin. Now, in this particular perspective, focus is on freedom from willful sin, freedom from the sin nature, and a heart oriented in love and obedience to God. From this perspective, the love of God in neighbor is the natural orientation of the heart. Fulfilling the two great commandments come naturally to someone who's entirely sanctified, and there is the full expression of the fruit of the Spirit as defined in Galatians 5:22. However, in this perspective, this love in fruit may not always be expressed to the full extent humanly capable. It may be limited by ignorance, it may be limited by physical limitations, or it may be limited by emotional trauma. And there is a sense in which this view of entire sanctification is a modified view of John Wesley's famous tract, A Character of a Methodist. Many of you have read this tract, A Character of a Methodist, in which John Wesley says that a Methodist is always rejoicing, always joyful, always thankful. And so there's a sense in which everything is taken to the fullest extent within the character of a Methodist. And this particular teaching says Yes, we're set free from willful sin. Yes, we're set free from an orientation towards sin, so that it is the natural inclination of the heart to love and obey God. But there may be some limitations in regard to the full extent that that love is made manifest in life. And so this is called entire sanctification as freedom from willful and original sin. And again, key to this understanding is understanding original sin from a phenomenological perspective. Most of the time when we talk about original sin, we talk about original sin as an orientation, a bend, a propensity towards rebellion and disobedience, a bend towards selfishness in our lives. And so this view understands that when we've been set free from original sin, instead of having a bend towards rebellion and disobedience, we now have a propensity or bend towards obedience and towards love. But there may be some limitations that are associated with that. So this is point C. Entire sanctification is freedom from willful and original sin. And then next is point D, entire sanctification as perfection in love. The focus is not only on freedom from willful sin and the sin nature, but the focus is on the perfection of love in a believer. Entire sanctification is truly having the mind of Christ, loving God and neighbor fully and completely without equivocation, made manifest fully, always, in attitude and action. This is continually loving God and neighbor to the full extent to which they can be loved. And the fruit of the Spirit is made manifest fully at all times and in all places in the believer's life. And probably maybe the best statement of this view would be John Wesley's famous tract, The Character of a Methodist. In many ways, I think John Wesley articulates this particular view in that tract. But it is entire sanctification as perfection in love. We are always in a state in which we're loving God with the full extent to which we are capable of loving. And that we are loving neighbor to the full extent that we are capable of loving. And the fruit of the Spirit is always made manifest in our lives to the full extent that it can be made manifest in our lives. This is a higher view of entire sanctification. And then finally, the highest view that I have observed is entire sanctification as freedom from all temptation. Now, there's a sense in which the focus here is on the immutability of the entirely sanctified state. So that freedom from willful sin, freedom from the sin nature, and perfection in love makes Christians impervious to temptation and makes them impervious to the possibility of sin. Entire sanctification is an immutable state. This state places entirely sanctified Christians in a higher state than even Adam and Eve had before the fall. Now, let me just simply say, this is a view that has reared its head periodically in the Methodist revival in England. Many of you will remember, can't remember if it's Maxfield and Bell, the 1760s in London. John Wesley had to deal with this sort of teaching of perfection. But it has also periodically appeared in our 19th century Holiness tradition as well. And so periodically this has arisen in life. And so anyway, these are at least 5 kind of basic understandings of entire sanctification. Again, this is a sort of a spectrum that I am trying to paint here. These particular positions may be nuanced in different ways by different pastors and by different theologians. But these are kind of 5 perspectives that I have, at least in my life, at some place have either read or I have had articulated to me either through preaching or teaching. And so this is what I'd like for us to do at this moment. Let's just take a few moments And I'll give you a chance to look again at this list. And I have two questions for you. This is where you could be even more helpful to me. First of all, which ones of these teachings have you observed in the Wesleyan holiness tradition? Which of these have you seen? Which of these have you read? Which of these have you heard? Which of these have these been communicated in one way or another to you? And then the second question I want to ask is there another understanding of entire sanctification that you have heard articulated that would not necessarily fall in this spectrum? So let me just give you a few moments. What I'd like for you to do is have an opportunity to have a conversation with your neighbor. This is where I become a classroom teacher again. And class participation, in my class participation, there are significant points and grading that go on. Of course, I can't force that in this sort of setting, but I'm going to ask you kind of in the spirit of our meeting to interact and share with a neighbor, which one of these views have you heard communicated in your life? And then the second question is there a particular understanding of entire sanctification that you've heard articulated that you feel like that may not have been, wouldn't fit within the spectrum that I've given here? Two questions. And so take a few moments. You can overlook these, but share your responses with your neighbor. Yes.
On this one, when people might think that Christians, like after Christ, have a higher standing than Adam and Eve.
Yep. There's a sense in which, Adam and Eve were capable of falling. They did fall. So to say that one is incapable of falling is to place them in a higher state than even Adam and Eve enjoyed in the garden before the fall.
I've never really heard it that way, but I've heard something to the tune that Christians are, because the Holy Spirit is inside of them, living inside them, that it seems that they are in a better, not.
But what we teach is that the Holy Spirit reigned and ruled in the heart of Adam and Eve before the fall. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had the Holy Spirit before the fall. Let me give you 2 more minutes, 2 minutes to finish.
This would seem to me that this would be sense of infirmity.
Yes, yes.
Is that the distinction between these two?
A little bit more than that, but that's one of them.
That's one of the main.
Yes, yes. Yes. Oh, yes.
I was wondering if in your sequencing of things here, if being perfected in love is in fact higher than the one that believes that depravity is dealt with too. In other words, wouldn't the Keswickians affirm the pursuit of love as the pursuit of holiness? But
Yes.
they don't quite believe depravity can be dealt with.
That's right. They believe that we're always going to be in this state, and when this war of flesh and spirit is always. Yeah, that's right. And there's a sense in which those that follow that view have this idea. No, there may be occasional skirmishes, but that war has been settled in the heart, and so that it is not a battle to be obedient. It is not a battle to love. Whereas in this one view would say we can love and we can be obedient, but there's always a battle involved in it, an ongoing battle.
Is there a possibility like Finney's theology? Is it represented here, Finney's theology, the naturalistic view that the image of God does enable you to simply consecrate yourself? That's kind of Palmerist.
Yes, it is. It is Palmerist. And there's a sense in which Finney is in that sort of semi-Pelagian camp. Yeah. Or I've heard, what is that? Stimulating. Let me have your attention up front again. Now, we might be asking, you may be asking this question, who cares about this? I mean, why make all these sort of divisions and stuff? Let me just say why I believe it is important. Because I think all too often at times in our Wesleyan holiness tradition, we settle for something far less than what we could have. We settle for something far less than what we could have. And again, I mentioned to you yesterday, my concern is helping people to enter in to this work of grace. And I don't want them to settle for something less. Another concern that I have is that sometimes we can set the bar, so to speak, so high that in reality we end up having people so discouraged that they seek nothing at all. And so that's a part of my concern here. For those of you who have been in, I know, Dr. Urey's Wesley class, and in other classes, those of you who have studied Wesley, this has been an ongoing debate in regard to how we articulate this message of holiness. You know, there are conversations that took place between John and Charles Wesley over whether or not John was setting it too high, or whether or not it should be a lowered view. And there is a sense in which there are lower and higher views that exist out in our Wesleyan Arminian holiness tradition. And so beginning to understand what we can believe, God to do in our life becomes incredibly important. But I do know this, that there are people that I've worked with, that I've counseled, that I genuinely believe, while God has done a work in their life, They have settled for something that is far less than what they could have and experience. And then I believe that there are times and places that I've worked where people have set the bar so high, I'm not sure that it is achievable in this life. And let me tell you the problem with that. And you know this, for those of you who've grown up in the tradition, especially if you tie in the concept of holiness or hell to this, it can become extremely problematic. So that if you say that you have to be born again and entirely sanctified to make it to heaven, and you set entire sanctification as this perfection in life, for instance, in which there is no possibility of temptation and no possibility of falling, it can become extremely problematic for people who are earnestly seeking God but never, ever achieving that level of perfection in this life. And so there are problems with setting it too low, and there are problems that are associated with setting it too high. And so our ability to think through what are we talking about here becomes incredibly important. Of course, there are other ways of dealing with it than simply the way I'm going about doing it now. But from my perspective, and it really is a humble perspective, I do see it as being something that is important. And so let's just take a few moments here and let's see what you've seen in your life and in your preaching, teaching, and what has been communicated. How many of you have heard articulated entire sanctification as entire consecration? That is something that has been communicated. That has been something that you have seen. Okay, how about entire sanctification as freedom from willful sin? Well, that is where the focus is. Okay, how about entire sanctification as freedom from willful and original sin? Okay, how many entire sanctification as perfection in love? Okay, and how many entire sanctification as freedom from all temptation? Okay, so it does exist. Now, I had David here who was saying that he has heard, at least in preaching, one of the higher levels preached, and then the altar call, and after the altar call, one of them settled for. There's some others who are saying, yes, I know what that is as well. In your conversation, is there another perspective that maybe isn't articulated here that you would bring forth? Yes. Sure.
One thing I have read is Wesley's Eucharistic hymn, and I feel like he espouses an idea of the real presence of Jesus. Jesus' life, the life of God inside our flesh. And that to me is more appealing than his spirit, something happening to me. But actually, God loving me so much and desiring to dwell in my human flesh with His own self and transforming me. That's what I read more than the experience. Seeking the experience has been very confusing to me. And so that idea that I've read in Wesley and from the early fathers, that union with Christ, participation in God. I like those phrases. Those move me more than what will happen to me if I experience an experience. I like the intimate relational presence of God.
Yes, and you have, and I appreciate that, and even in your comments yesterday, that bringing this to the personal and relational level. And that is a beautiful and powerful imagery and an understanding of what happens, not only in the work of salvation, but in the work of sanctification. Christ in us, Christ through us. Yeah. And how would that play out, Brian? Okay. Or it can be. It is to be separated from the world, so that ultimately how I define whether I'm sanctified or not is defined by how separated I am from the world. Okay, Ron.
I wonder if like in the 20th century Pentecostal view, sanctification doesn't sometimes become synonymous with the gifting and empowering of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. And I don't know where that would fit on the spectrum, so I wonder if that's in there somewhere.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a sense in which, and even in our holiness tradition, we have emphasized this empowerment for service that takes place. We've often associated with terms entire sanctification, Christian perfection, baptism with the Spirit. There's a number of language that we use. But part of it in this second work of grace that we talk about this empowerment for service. And I'm not sure that is articulated in this. Although it is the sense of being set free to love and service is there. But you're right, I don't think that's articulated in this. And yet it has been something that we have certainly emphasized in our Wesleyan holiness tradition. Good. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, we work in China all the time, the house church, paradigm of suffering. And the only requirement to join a house church is if you're willing to suffer for Christ. And those who have suffered greatly are elevated in leadership and spiritual authority. And the people who come to the Lord come experientially mostly. People come through healing miracles, answers to prayers. The typical Christian would be illiterate. They would have dreams every night from the Lord for revelation, and all of their teaching and preaching would revolve around the paradigm of suffering.
Okay.
I don't know if that's on here or not.
Right. It doesn't. It's not expressed in that, but it is there. There is a sense in which what Christ in us, to use Diane's imagery, the Spirit of God ruling and reigning in our hearts and our lives empower us to suffer and to live and to deny ourselves and to pick up our cross and follow Christ wherever that may take us in life. Good. Anyone else? Okay. Yes. What denomination was that? Okay. Yes. My own denomination, the UMC. There is a sense in which in the United Methodist Church, generally, at least among pastors, there is this idea of, you always are asked this question in ordination, do you expect to be made perfect in this life? And technically, you can't be ordained in the United Methodist Church unless you can answer that question affirmatively. But generally, in the United Methodist Church, at least among the clergy, we kind of see Christian perfection up here, again, something that is never going to be fully realized in this life. Will only really ultimately take place in glorification. Even though we affirm, when we took our vows, for ordination in the UMC, that we do expect to be made perfect in this life. Yes?
Dr. Downs, I don't know how this is that word sanctification talks about it presented in terms of death to self-will. That's not quite the same as consecration. Giving up my will for going to that. I don't know how that would fit in.
Yeah.
In the paradigm.
There is a wonderful church father. I was trying to remember 8th century. I may be wrong on this. 8th century, a guy by the name of Maximus the Confessor. And Maximus talks about the two wills of Christ, the human will and the divine will, and how they're brought into unity through the Spirit. And he's trying to argue, how can there be two wills in Christ and yet there be one person? But what's interesting is there is a model within Maximus, which is the idea that our will and God's will are brought together in the power and the hold of the Spirit, so that we will what God wills, even as the human mind of Jesus, the human will of Jesus willed what God willed as well. And so that is a powerful imagery. I don't think you're right that I've stated that in this as clearly as it could be stated. But there is a sense in which it is a death to self-will, to will what God wills in life.
One of the issues in all of this is what was the hallmark when I was in seminary. If you believe in the eradication of the sin nature, you're Wesleyan. If you believe in suppression of sin nature, you're Catholic.
Yes.
Are you saying that C, D, and E would all be eradication?
That's a good question. Next question. Let me just kind of respond quickly to Dr. Oswald's question. It is. It's important.
There are those who will say, if you believe in eradication, E is the only expression of that.
Yes. Let me just talk briefly about that. You've noticed, at least in my discussion of the sin nature, original sin, I haven't told you what it is. I have tried to avoid doing that in our discussion here, but I see that I am going to be drawn into it. Rather, what I have done is I've tried to discuss it phenomenologically, how it is made manifest in our life. But there is this discussion as to what it is exactly. And let me just simply say that there are a couple of ideas that are associated with that, and I'll try to articulate what are three ideas as to what it is.
You're planning to deal with these later or tomorrow.
No, I'm not. Oh, yes. No, I'm not. So let me get a chance to do that. That's all right. This happens all the time in the classroom for me. No. What is the sin nature? Well, I think that there are three kind of major theories as to what it is. What is it that orientates our will and our hearts in rebellion and disobedience? What is this sin nature? There have been some. These are three thoughts. There are some who have said that the nature itself is some sort of substance. Either some sort of physical substance that attaches itself to our physical bodies. And let me just simply say this for those who are in psychology working with an extreme monistic model. There are some who are arguing in Christian circles today that indeed this nature is some sort of gene or genetic aspect of how we're constituted physically as human beings. And so there is this idea associated with it. If we could just find out what that gene is, we could remove it. Of course, you've seen this in the sort of studies that are associated with this assertion that we can find the alcoholic gene, the homosexual gene, and we could solve or those sort of issues. So a physical substance. There are some who may buy into a more dichotomist or trichotomist view of human constitution, who would say that it is some sort of spiritual substance that associates, that is attached to our souls, that is attached to our bodies. Let me just say this. I have problems with this whole idea of substance. Okay, I have problems with this substance view. But let me tell you the second view. The second view is that what this nature is in fact absence. It's absence. And what it is the absence of the rule or the reign of the Holy Spirit in the heart and life of a believer. This particular theory has this idea that Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall, the Spirit lived in them, reigned and ruled in them, and ordered their desires and ordered their passions, their God-given desires and their God-given passions. And that when they fell, the Holy Spirit departed, and their desires kind of went haywire, inordinate desire. And so there's a sense, what is it, this propensity towards rebellion and disobedience? It arises out of the absence of the rule or reign of the Spirit in the heart and the life of a person. And then there is the third theory, which is the idea that this nature is the corruption of the image and likeness of God in humanity. And many of you have had, you know this, John Wesley had this understanding that there was kind of a trifold image and likeness within humanity. He talked about the moral image, he talked about the natural image, and he talked about the political image. And what Wesley taught, in line with the Reformers as well, is that when the fall took place, the moral image, which has to do with the character of humanity, which has everything to do with holiness, righteousness, and love, was completely destroyed in humanity. What he called the natural image, which has to do with our understanding, our reason, our reasoning powers, our affections, was not completely destroyed, but was extensively marred. So we were not devoid completely of reason and understanding, but we didn't have the rational capacities that Adam and Eve had before the fall. Marred, but not destroyed. And then there was the political image in humanity, which enabled humanity to relate and to organize within society, to relate to the world, to relate to each other, and to kind of organize themselves. And again, Wesley believed that was extensively marred, but not completely destroyed. And so this is one of those interesting issues because in many ways, Wesley believes that what original sin is, it is the corrupted image and likeness of God in humanity. The image is broken within humanity. And so he primarily understands, or one of the primary rubrics under which he understands this work of salvation is the restoration of the image and likeness of God in humanity. Now, what's interesting for Wesley, and let me just say this, if this sin nature is the corrupted image and likeness of God in humanity, to a certain extent, even Wesley himself would say we are never set free from that. That is not ever fully restored in this life. But what Wesley does is he actually ties the nature to the moral nature. And so that in this life, John Wesley believes that the moral nature can be completely restored. And we can make progress in regard to the natural and the political, but those cannot be completely restored. And hence, this is the reason why Wesley is able to make a distinction between willful sin and the orientation of one's heart and sins of infirmity. So, for instance, I can, in my moral nature, be completely renewed. That holiness and love are the orientation of my heart and in my life. But I still do not see clearly. I still have poor judgment. I do not understand everything as well as I should. And so as holiness and love is made manifest in life, it can be made manifest in ways that fall short of the perfect will of God because of lack of understanding and lack of reasoning.
On your chart, you would be saying he doesn't bring that out very clearly in the character of the Methodist.
I would say that, yes. Well, maybe. Depends on where I fall on that chart. You're getting ahead of me here, Dr. Oswald. Yes. But let me just say this, and I am using these terms. I am using language here. And let me just step back real quickly and bring our discussion back to Diane. Language is only as effective as it is able to communicate the reality. And I am not necessarily tied to the language that we use. But I am concerned about the reality and how we go about communicating that reality. And there is language that we can use, while helpful, may not be the best language to use in all circumstances. And so part of our job as pastors, and as I should say theologians, is in our context of ministry, finding the best language to communicate this deeper reality. But anyway, getting back to Dr. Oswald's question here, again, it goes back what happens in being, say, set free from original sin. And just to say this, I am probably reluctant to use the language of eradication. And one of the reasons why is because eradication as a language, I like maybe the idea to which it points. But all too often, it has attached with it this understanding of the nature as substance. And I don't like that. So it's not language that I use. I kind of understand what it's pointing towards, but do not necessarily. Just to let you know, where do I fall in regard to this? What happens in the work of entire sanctification? There's a sense in which I do accept this idea that it is the reign and rule of the Spirit that comes into the human heart, in the human life, and a restoration of the corrupted image of God in this life. But I'm not sure that the image and likeness of God is, I don't believe that the image and likeness of God is completely restored in this life. The moral image is, but not the natural and the political image. That's the essence.
Well, sure.
Sure.
I mean, we can't say that if the Holy Spirit reigns now, it restores us to a pre-Adamic fall where there was perfection among the humans.
Yeah, that's right. And this is a sense in which Wesley is very helpful here. That whatever Christian perfection is, it is not Adamic perfection. It does not place us at the place that Adam and Eve were before the fall, and it certainly doesn't make us superior to where Adam and Eve were before the fall. Well, because we recognize that we have reasoning limitations in this life. That regardless of how far I advance in the work of salvation, no matter how much I grow in grace in this life, my rational capacities will always be limited in this life. My ability to understand, my ability to make judgments and be wise and discerning in judgments is always going to be affected by the fall. And so this is the reason why we will talk about that. I can do something in love, and my motivation is holiness in love, and end up doing it wrong. I mentioned, just as an example, we can all see this in human relationships or begin to conceive of it, where we genuinely love someone and we're wanting to do what is in the best interest of that person. We're wanting to genuinely serve and genuinely give ourselves to that person. and then we make poor judgment decisions and end up really messing up things.
But I don't know if that answered my question, because would not a reformed view of sanctification say the same thing true morally? But in this life there will be moral limitations that will not let us fully live in it.
Oh, yes.
And our response to that is, no, because God, through His Spirit, empowered us to live that way. And I'm simply pondering, why do we not push that into these other categories in the whole of life?
Yeah.
No, we don't, and that's where I am.
Right. Sure. And I think that is a part of of at least the Wesleyan understanding is it is not perfect. It does push out into the natural, into the political. That's a part of what it is to move towards greater maturity. And one has greater wisdom, one has greater knowledge, one has greater understanding. And therefore there is improvement that takes place. But again, Wesley is in his work trying to clarify what sets him apart from, say, the Reformed tradition, which was a part of his own Anglican tradition, and also set him apart from those who were also articulating a perfection that even superseded that which Adam had in life and was an immutable perfection in this life. But let me say this, one of the fundamental areas for me in regard to this issue, it's this. And this is what sets, I think, the Wesleyan teaching apart from the Reformed and Lutheran. Now hear me, I think you heard me say this. The Reformed, John Calvin has a high view of sanctification. And as a matter of fact, John Calvin uses the wonderful imagery that Diane was pointing out to. It is primarily understood as union with Christ. And that our sanctification arises out of our union with Christ. So Calvin has a very high view of sanctification, as does Martin Luther. And so, but this is the difference, and this is something that Ron and I were talking about earlier. And it has everything to do with this propensity. It has everything to do with the sin nature. And the larger question is, can in this life my propensity and orientation towards sin be broken? So that it is, instead of struggling and wrestling with obedience to Christ, struggling and wrestling and walking out in love, can that be taken care of? So that my natural disposition is to love and it is to serve and be obedient. Not to say, I'm giving myself away here. I don't want to give myself away here. But
let me say, in response to Brian, I think a very simplistic answer is it's because we believe the Bible does teach that the moral image can be restored, and it doesn't teach that the
natural and political image.
can be restored. Now, they can
That's
argue
true.
with us on
That's
that,
true.
but that's our conviction that the Bible does teach this and doesn't teach the restoration of the other nature.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah. That would be our approach. Yes.
Just to illustrate that, I think the illustration comes from the Apostle Paul himself. After he really addresses the issue of sanctification, he begins his discussion of glorification with the body.
Yeah. You're right.
I think that's important for us to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so that there's a sense in which glorification is a part of the Ordo Salutis. It is a part of the order of salvation. It is a part of what God is doing. There are things that we would agree with in the Reformed tradition, that there are things that God can only address in glorification and not in this life, finally, in this life. Let's see, one question over here, and then I'll come over. Or
One of the things that bothers me about Wesley is trying to understand one of his taught explicitly connected to it. But the other is, can error in the political become so egregious that they call it question a moral perfection of the moral nature? For example, the whole issue